The summer of 1941 concealed a terrible secret. On the 22nd of June, just as the sun broke the horizon, the silence of the eastern border was shattered by the opening salvos of Operation Barbarossa. This was no mere military action. It was the titanic collision of ideologies, the true beginning of the war in the East. Adolf Hitler, driven by an unyielding desire to eradicate what he viewed as the Slavic menace and seize vital living space, launched the largest land invasion in human history. A staggering force of 3.8 million Axis soldiers, spearheaded by thousands of tanks and aircraft, surged across a front that spanned 1,000 miles. Their arrogant objective, given a timeline of just 5 months, was to crush the vast, sprawling Soviet Union and bring the entire nation to its knees before winter. The immense assault slammed into a Soviet regime paralyzed by fatal errors. Joseph Stalin, deaf to the repeated warnings from his own intelligence apparatus, was convinced that Hitler would never risk a strike. This complacency, compounded by the murderous purges of the late 1930s that had terrorized and hollowed out the Red Army's officer corps, left the defenders unable to react. The opening hours were not a fight, but a total catastrophe. The German Luftwaffe obliterated the Soviet Air Force while it was still grounded, and the armoured might of the panzer divisions, utilising the devastating blitzkrieg tactic, tore through the disorganised Soviet lines like paper. The speed of the advance was so brutal that it rendered the Red Army's existing defences obsolete instantly. As many Soviet frontline units were woefully equipped with older, sometimes obsolete equipment that was completely ineffective against the coordinated modern German armour. The German military machine was structured into 3 colossal army groups, each assigned an impossible target. Army Group North focused on sealing off Leningrad, the historic birthplace of the revolution. Army Group South tore through the fertile, boundless plains of Ukraine, aiming to secure the vital food resources. But the crucial, overwhelming objective fell to Army Group Center. The seizure of Moscow, the beating political, logistical, and spiritual heart of the Soviet state. Within weeks, the scope of the German victory was measured not in mere mileage, but in captured regions and entire armies encircled. The sheer pace of the initial momentum was historically unprecedented, often leaving exhausted German infantry formations hundreds of miles behind their own lead tank columns. This rapid advance, however, began to expose a crucial weakness: the German supply chain. The Wehrmacht relied on European standard rail gauges, meaning they had to spend precious weeks and vast manpower reconstructing the Soviet rail lines. A monumental logistical nightmare that created immediate vulnerabilities to partisan attacks. On July the 17th, the Army Group Center captured Smolensk, the historic gateway to the capital. The last major natural obstacle on the road to Moscow was gone. Watching from capitals across the globe, military analysts grimly concluded the Soviet Union's defeat was inevitable. Stalin, jolted finally into grim reality, faced a truly hopeless military picture. Though he technically had nearly 1 million men available, only 25 of his 83 divisions retained any meaningful combat readiness. The rest were shattered, demoralized remnants desperately short of weapons and vehicles. In a powerful, politically calculated speech, Stalin dropped the rigid language of communism and instead invoked the powerful historical legacy of Russian nationalism, calling for the defense of Mother Russia to mobilize a deep-seated patriotic fervor among his citizens. It was against these skeleton forces that the Germans prepared their final act. On September 30th, 1941, the operation known as Typhoon was unleashed. The German strategy was a cold masterpiece of maneuver designed to completely eradicate the remaining Soviet field armies. At Bryansk and further north at Vyazma, the jaws of the 3rd and 4th Panzer Armies snapped shut in a colossal encirclement, trapping a massive 6 Soviet armies. The devastation was absolute. While the Germans achieved textbook maneuver warfare, They did so at the catastrophic cost of exhausting their tank engines, depleting their fuel, and stretching their lines perilously thin. The main line of Moscow's defense had not just been broken, it had been completely annihilated. In these pockets alone, over 660,000 Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner, driving the total number of captured since June to an almost incomprehensible 3 million men. These human waves were funneled into concentration camps where starvation and exposure were tools of deliberate extermination, highlighting the horrific human cost of the entire campaign. The path to Moscow now lay terrifyingly open. Stalin was left with a skeleton force of perhaps 90,000 exhausted men and a mere 150 tanks to defend a city of millions. By October the 13th, the lead elements of German armour were a mere 87 miles from the Kremlin's imposing spires. A freezing fog of panic descended on the city. Key officials and essential factories were frantically evacuated, and martial law was declared. In the city's outskirts, over 400,000 Muscovites, primarily women, elderly citizens and teenagers, were conscripted to dig hundreds of miles of deep anti-tank ditches, lay wire, and construct barricades using only pickaxes and shovels. Their desperate civilian labour created the final thin crust of defence for the capital. The city was being hastily transformed into a fortress, but it was a fortress essentially without an army. Yet, just when German victory seemed inevitable, the very earth of Russia rose in defiance. An ancient and undefeated general took command. General Mudd. The relentless autumn rains, known locally as the Rasputitsa, began. The vast unpaved roads of the Soviet interior dissolved into a churning, impassable quagmire. German tanks, with their narrow European tracks, sank up to their turrets. Supply trucks, the very lifeline of the offensive, became hopelessly mired, sometimes struggling to advance a single mile per day. During this standstill, the Germans lost more tanks to mechanical failures caused by the mud and overuse than they did to actual enemy action. The Blitzkrieg, a strategy that depended entirely on lightning speed, was literally stuck. Reluctantly, on the 31st of October, the German High Command was forced to call a temporary halt to the operation. This desperate pause, granted by the sudden weather shift, was the crucial miracle the Soviets needed. Stalin, now displaying the brutal energy that defined his rule, used the time to mobilize his nation's deepest reserves. Crucially, the intelligence officer Richard Sorge, operating in Tokyo, had confirmed that Japan would not attack the Soviet Far East, allowing Stalin to safely commit 18 full-strength divisions hardened by the Siberian climate to the defense of Moscow. These troops, who viewed the snow not as an obstacle, but as their natural environment, began a 1,000-mile journey westward. Simultaneously, from evacuated factories now safely operating behind the Ural Mountains, a new stream of T-34 tanks, arguably the best tank of the war, began pouring onto the front lines. As the temperature plummeted, the mud froze, turning the ground into iron-hard, rutted terrain. The German offensive could resume. On November 15th, the panzers lurched forward once more. The objective was a final, decisive encirclement of Moscow. But now, the Germans faced their second greater enemy, General Winter. The temperatures plunged to unthinkable levels for November. 20, then 30, then 40 degrees below zero. For the German soldiers, tragically still issued light summer uniforms, it was a waking vision of hell. Frostbite became as great a threat as enemy bullets. Machine guns refused to fire unless continually heated by torches, and the standard German lubricants froze solid, requiring soldiers to manually push the firing pins with tools, drastically reducing their firepower. Tank engines refused to start without being constantly warmed by roaring open fires. The Soviets, clad in their warm white winter camouflage and felt boots, were perfectly prepared. They met the freezing, exhausted Germans with ferocious localized resistance. For 2 agonizing weeks, the German armies clawed their way forward, fighting desperately for every frozen village and patch of forest. In the south, the 2nd Panzer Group was bled white and completely halted before the city of Tula. In the north, the 4th Panzer Group, in one last superhuman effort, managed to push across the frozen Moscow-Volga Canal. Small advance units of the 7th Panzer Division found themselves just 22 miles from Red Square, but they were utterly spent. A ghost of the force that had begun the invasion, they could go no further. Near the small factory town of Khimki, barely 18 miles from the Kremlin, the German offensive reached its absolute catastrophic limit. This location remains the definitive high-water mark of the Third Reich. The small, isolated group of German troops waited for phantom reinforcements that would never arrive. On December 3rd, they were swiftly pushed out by a hastily assembled force of local militia and a few tanks. Today, the spot is marked by a simple, stark memorial of giant anti-tank obstacles. On December 5, 1941, the German offensive against Moscow officially stalled and died. The storm of Operation Typhoon had utterly blown itself out. Then, across the entire front, the Red Army, which the world had written off for dead, unleashed a massive, unexpected counter-offensive. 100 new divisions, including the elite Siberian ski troops, slammed into the freezing, shattered German lines. For the German soldiers, the nightmare was complete. The hunters had become the hunted. By the time the Soviet offensive halted in January of 1942, the Germans had been hurled back, in some places over 150 miles from the gates of Moscow. The existential threat to the capital was over. The battle had cost the two sides a combined total of over 2 million casualties, a staggering toll of human suffering. The myth of German invincibility lay shattered, frozen forever in the endless Russian snow. The epic struggle for the soul of the Soviet Union was far from over, but its most critical turning point had been reached. The long, bloody road to Berlin had begun.